So today we'll be testing the Nvidia GeForce GTX 1650 Super in Cyberpunk 2077. That's quite a long name. So what we've got it paired with is an Intel CPU, a 12400F, 6-core 12-thread CPU, and we've also got 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 MHz CL16 memory. Right, so what we're going to be doing is we'll be testing at different resolutions and different presets. So I want to show you, I've got my crowd density set to low at the moment. We've got the low preset enabled. I know it shows custom, but we've got the low preset enabled, and then I just disable FSR, and we are currently sitting at 1080p. All right, let's get right to it. Now, if you glance to the top left-hand corner there, you'll see we've got some performance metrics. I'm not going to go over everything, but we've got our GPU temperatures and usage. We've got our CPU usage, our VRAM and memory usage, and then we've also got our frame time graphs and frame rate averages, 1% lows and 0.1% lows. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to try and make my benchmark runs a little bit shorter, purely because we've got quite a few settings to go over. What I'll be doing is I'm going to be driving up this road here. We'll make a U-turn, we'll come back, try and do a few burnouts around the circle and capture our numbers. Now, this is the first time I am playing with the controller, so just excuse my driving. Now, as you can see, whilst driving, this game is pretty intensive. We are dropping below 60 frames per second quite a lot. We are getting an average of 49 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 39, our 0.1% lows are sitting at 37. But just have a look at the frame time graph there. It's actually pretty smooth. I haven't noticed much stuttering, and the input latency using a controller is definitely not terrible. I mean, it's not a 60 frames per second experience, and seeing that it's a first-person shooter, I'd assume that most of us would like it to be 60, so we'll play around with the graphical settings, we'll enable some FSR and see if we can actually get to that. But at 1080p native, we've got an average of 48. Alright, now we're just going to try the medium preset. Once again, I'm going to disable FSR. Let's see what happens. I'm just going to reset our numbers here. And we did drop quite a bit. We dropped about 10 frames per second. But then at these numbers, that's percentage-wise, it's quite high. Alright, but it's still not terrible. The game looks pretty good. It's sure it's only 1080p medium, but the game is graphically amazing actually, even at these settings. But ideally, if you have a 1650 Super, I don't think these settings are that realistic. Sure, we're getting about 38 frames per second here in this area. It might drop a little bit depending on which area you are. Also, driving is a little bit more intensive in this game, and this specific area is also very intensive. This is just outside of V's starting apartment, and the reason why I choose it is because it is actually quite heavy on the CPU and on the GPU. Alright, but there we have it for 1080p medium. We've got an average of 38 frames per second, 1% lows of 32, and 0.1% lows of 31. Once again, the frame time graph stayed pretty steady. Alright, we're going to try the high preset. Let me just get rid of that. So we're on the high preset, and we are going to disable FSR. Right, let me just apply that. Let's see how it goes. I'm assuming we'll be getting about 20 frames per second here. All right, and apparently we are getting the same frame rate as what we had on medium. Not sure how that is possible. I think the FSR setting did not apply, so let's just enable and disable FSR again. All right, let me just reset the numbers here. It seems like I was mistaken. It was still off. I mean, sure, now we're getting just below 30 frames per second every now and again. Previously we got about 40 frames per second, so that is more or less what we'd expect going from a medium to high. Sorry for wasting your time with that. Now driving around, we got motion blur enabled. That's terrible. Driving around, we can see that we are seeing some stuttering. I mean, our 0.1% lows are sitting at 13 frames per second. It might just me crashing into everything. The game doesn't like that. I mean, it's called Cyberbug for a reason. And it I know it's going to sound like an excuse, but driving does feel a little bit sluggish at these frame rates. Even with the controller, the inputs are very delayed, so it's pretty difficult to drive. But I think it'll still be better than trying to shoot with this controller. Seeing that it's my first time, I'm not even going to attempt that. Alright, this is at 1080p high, and we got an average of 33 frames per second, 1% lows of 28 and 0.1% lows of 18. All in all, this is actually a pretty good result. Remember, this is a very entry-level GPU. It was, I mean, it superseded the 1650 normal, and it might even be seen as a direct 1066 gig replacement. I mean, it compares to the RX 580 and GTX 1066 gig, so it's just got a little bit less VRAM, which is a little bit of an issue. But to be honest, at the settings that this card was designed for, you should not be running out of VRAM anyway. I think it's definitely more suitable at 1080p medium in most games, and in more demanding games like Cyberpunk, it's definitely required to use FSR. I mean, we can't use DLSS, so thanks again AMD for saving low-end Nvidia GPUs. Alright, but because we are a GPU testing channel, we need to test all the presets, so we're going to test the Ultra preset as well without FSR, and I mean, I don't expect any miracles here. Now we might be seeing the mid-20s. Let's see what happens. Alright, you can see there that the frame time graph was actually a little bit stuttery. It was, I think it was loading in all the textures, because for a few seconds there we were getting 15 frames per second, and that just happened. We were getting about 15 frames per second just whilst everything was loading in. You can see that our VRAM allocation is sitting at 3.6 gig. Remember, this card only has 4 gigs of VRAM. Now, that's not true VRAM usage. I did not even do anything. That's not true VRAM usage. It's just VRAM allocated. But we might be getting close to our VRAM limitation with these settings. Right, I don't think I'm going to be wasting too much time on this preset. 25 frames per second in a game like Cyberpunk is not playable to me personally anyway. This is pretty much what the Xbox One and PS4 original console owners felt like when the game first released. The game was running at between 20 and 30 frames per second, which was just terrible, and I don't think anybody should be trying to recreate that. Right, but driving around, we are getting an average of 25 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 14, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 8. So definitely not an ideal experience, and these settings you should avoid. Alright, but let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. I've got the low preset loaded here. Just go back to low, and then we'll just we'll manually set the FSR to quality. The sharpening you can adjust to your own liking. I don't like it when it's over sharpened, so I usually use 0.2. I just reloaded our save game, and we are back here in this circle outside of V's apartment. The lighting looks a little bit weird. I think it's an FSR thing. I saw this with the RX 580 as well. Not necessarily just FSR, but maybe FSR being used on the low preset at 1080p. I'm stuck on literally nothing. This is this is why it's called Cyberbug 2077. Right. I'm going to drive around again a little bit. As you can see, we are now getting our 60 frames per second. Well, we were getting 60 frames per second. It's not a constant, so we might have to increase the aggressiveness of FSR. Currently it's on quality, so we might need to move up to performance. But all in all, you can see our GPU is doing quite well. We're running at 62 degrees at 98% GPU usage. I'm not expecting this 12400F to even be close to a bottleneck with this GPU, with these settings. And I mean, we're only using about 80 watts of power, which is pretty good. It's almost no need for the supplemental PCIe connector, but sometimes I've seen the power usage go up to about 100 in game, and I mean the PCIe slot can only deliver up to 75 watts, so then you would definitely need supplemental power. Alright, so there we have it at 1080p low with FSR set to quality. We got an average of 60 frames per second, a 1% lows of 48 and a 0.1% lows of 44. I'm just going to test the performance preset and let's see what happens. Sorry, I said performance. I'm going to try the balanced preset first. I think that should be enough to give us a constant 60 frames per second. Let's just go back into the game and reset our numbers here. And now you can see we are getting around 70 frames per second. It still dips below 60. Definitely not what you want. And just if you look at the lighting there, that's just unfortunately the artifacting that upscaling introduces. This happens on DLSS and FSR both, though not to fault FSR here. But you can see that we did squeeze a little bit more performance out of the GPU. Our average is a little bit higher so far, but the increase is definitely not major. So we might just have to use the performance preset or performance setting of FSR to try and get a steady 60 frames per second. Now, once again, driving around in this game is definitely a lot more intensive. So walking around and maybe even in some gunfights, the performance might be a little bit better. I can definitely feel that it's more responsive. I'm not struggling as much with input latency, but definitely still not a constant 60 FPS. Alright, and now we're on FSR Performance, and see, for some reason the performance increase is not substantial. Sure, we're not dropping that much, but there we did drop below 60 frames per second again. We can see that our highs are a lot higher, but our average still seems to be more or less the same. I saw this exact same thing with the RX 580, where the highs would go into the 80s and then the lows would go into the 50s. Now, I'm not taking anything away from this little GPU here. It is a very small GPU, 100 watts. That stutter there was actually just an autosave, so you can disregard that. I'm just going to reset the numbers. It is a very entry-level budget GPU. It's actually the lowest of the stack. You can still get these 1650 Super GPUs new for about 4,000 Rand. Now that's about $200. I know they launched in the US for about $160, so it's definitely terrible value, but we actually picked this one up for about $100 second hand, and that's pretty much what the RX 580 and the 1066 gig is going for on the second hand market here in South Africa. Anyway, so you just gotta pick your poison, right? I mean, the performance of all three of these GPUs are pretty similar. It's just that the RX 580 definitely has a lot more VRAM. It's I'm talking about the 8 gig version. Then the 1060 has got 6 gig, and the 1650 Super only has 4 gig, right? But the performance in many games are similar, and some titles the AMD card would win, and then some games the GTX cards would win. I think the reason why people pick up the 1650 Super is because it's a bit of a newer card and with the same performance of a 1060. And as we all know, the 1060 6 gig was actually the most popular GPU in the Steam survey or Steam hardware survey for quite a while, and that's actually been surpassed now by the normal 1650, not the Super variant. And I'm not entirely sure why, because the performance difference between the 1650 Super and the normal 1650 is quite a lot, in some cases even up to 30%. Alright, so there we have it. If you want to get a 60 frames per second experience with the 1650 Super, then you would need to play on 1080p low with FSR Performance. Alright, but no benchmark is complete unless we test at 1440p, so here we go. Alright, here we are at 1440p. We are on the low preset, just with FSR disabled. I'm going to reload my save game and I'll see you just now. Alright, here we are at 1440p on the low preset with the FSR disabled, and I can immediately see quite an improvement in the graphic fidelity. It looks pretty good. I wouldn't mind playing the game at these settings, but once again we are getting about 30 frames per second. This GPU was not intended for 1440p gaming. The VRAM is a perfect indication of that, or the VRAM amount. So I mean, we should not be expecting one of the most demanding games currently available to perform very well at 1440p on one of the most budget GPUs that you can still buy new at the moment. I mean, sure, there is still the GT 1030, but sure, you only buy that if you want to replace your iGPU. Right, driving around here, I'm not going to waste too much time. We're getting about 30 frames per second. I'm not going to be testing multiple presets at 1440p purely because we will struggle. I'm just going to see how close we can get to a 60 FPS experience by enabling some FSR settings. Right, so now we're back at 1440p, the low preset with FSR on performance. And you can see the frame rate is fluctuating quite a little bit. Our highs are once again close to the 70s, and then our lows are in the 40s. So the difference between the highs and lows is pretty big, and that's something that you definitely will notice while playing the game. And I pressed the wrong button. That's not handbrake turn. Let's get back in. As you can see, getting out of the car, we're getting 60 frames per second. Getting back in the car, we're getting 55 frames per second. So I'm driving around purely just to give you the worst case scenario, because you do spend a lot of your time in your car in this game. So I don't want to create any false expectations. So running around on foot, you'll be getting 60 frames per second. And then the moment you get in your car, you're getting 45. Right, so the next step in our quest to 60 FPS is to enable FSR Ultra Performance. We can't do much after that, so if we don't get 60 FPS with FSR Ultra Performance, then I guess we won't be getting 60 FPS at all at 1440p. All right, and we are back, and you can see that we are barely getting that 60 frames per second whilst standing still. So I mean, when you want to take screenshots or photos using photo mode, then you'll definitely be getting 60 frames per second. And once again, I don't think I hit that guy. Maybe I got a little bit too close to him and ran over his toes or something. But driving around, I mean, it is very closer to a constant 60 frames per second than previously. Even on FSR Performance, we did drop into the mid 40s. We dropped into the mid 50s there for a few, but overall, it's definitely not bad. Sure, it's not looking as detailed and as sharp as at native, but FSR can only do so much. Remember, on FSR Ultra Performance, we are lowering the internal resolution by quite a lot. I think it's even upscaling from like 480p or 560p, somewhere around there, when Ultra Performance is enabled at 1440p. So don't expect any miracles when it comes to graphic quality. I mean, it definitely is still playable. And if you want to play Cyberpunk and you've got a 1440p panel with the GTX 1650 Super, then I guess this is the setting that you should be using. Alright, I'm not going to be testing many presets at 4K either, but I want to see if we do run out of VRAM at 4K. Right, we're now at 4K. I'm going to enable the low preset here and disable FSR, just to get a baseline performance number, and then we'll see if we start running out of VRAM. Just resetting the numbers there, you can see we're getting 18 frames per second. The frame time graph is very, very consistent, and I think that's because we are running out of VRAM here. There's no fluctuation in that graph. Sure, the VRAM allocation still only shows 3.8 gigs, but I'm pretty sure either the GPU just can't handle anything at 4K, or we have run out of VRAM, and we are now reverting to system memory, and obviously system memory is a lot slower than VRAM. I mean, the game looks gorgeous even on the low presets. It's just not playable. Sure, you can go into photo mode and take some very crisp looking photos, enter the Twitter competitions that CDPR usually have, but other than that, 4K is definitely not for this card. I mean, we did not expect it to be. We just wanted to see what the performance is like. This is on 4K low preset without FSR. I'm just going to see what it does at 4K Ultra, because I'm curious to see what happens once we officially run out of VRAM. Alright, and we back on 4K Ultra, and this is looking like a slideshow. I mean, I've seen PowerPoint slideshows move faster than this, and this is the same as what we had in The Witcher 3. Right? It's not just the frame rate that's slow. It's just it feels like the whole game is just not responding at all. It's the whole game slows down. The audio seems fine, but the whole game is just extremely slow. It's it's actually quite funny. It takes me back to the good old days when I still gamed on a Graphics Blaster Extreme 4 meg GPU. Yeah, that's 4 meg, not 4 gig. This is pretty much what the frame rate we had when we ran at 800 by 600, and we enabled any hardware acceleration features on that GPU. Well, back then it was just called a 3D card, not a graphics accelerator card or GPU or whatever it's called nowadays. Yeah, so this is pretty nostalgic and also pretty funny. You can see our GPU usage is sitting at 100% still, but our power draw is fluctuating quite a lot, 63 there. So it just means that somewhere there's a bottleneck within the GPU, and it might not be the GPU chip itself, so I'm guessing memory. Alright, I'm going to just go into the menu here because I just can't stand that. That's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.